Good morning. Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to welcome our members, guests, and C-SPAN Book TV to this public affairs program. Our guest today is Serhii Plokhy. He is Professor of Ukraine History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. His book, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, will, as he writes, not only lift the curtain of time on the dramatic events leading up to the lowering of the Soviet flag and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it will also provide a much-needed context for what is happening in the Ukraine today. The long-standing narrative of the end of the Cold War is one that has entwined the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the triumph of democratic values over communism. It is a narrative that has persisted for decades, with adverse consequences for America's standing in the world and the perception of what we could accomplish. But for Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was, as he has often said, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. This, in turn, has led many Western analysts to accuse him of using this current crisis to rewrite the history of the Soviet collapse and resurrect the Soviet empire. The story of the uncoupling of the Soviet Union, as told in The Last Empire, presents a bold new interpretation of the Soviet Union's final months. While the Soviet Union disintegrated for a variety of reasons, not least the bankruptcy, moral and actual, of the Soviet system, in placing events in the Ukraine and other republics at the center of the drama, Professor Plokhy provides the historical background for what is happening now. As unrest continues in the eastern part of the Ukraine, with pro-Russian separatists destabilizing the region and complicating Kiev's efforts to integrate with the West, you might wonder why not only Putin but Russian nationalists view Ukraine as an integral part of their own national story and find it difficult to adjust to the reality of an independent Ukraine. The Last Empire will provide many of the much-needed answers for understanding the historical roots of the crisis and why Moscow's struggle with the growing spirit of independence among constituent republics. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, Serhii Plokhy. Thank you for joining us. And let me just remind you to please turn off all your cell phones and any other electronic devices. Thank you. Serhii? Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, John, thanks a lot for this wonderful introduction. I want to thank everyone for coming on this early Monday morning. Finally, the rains are over, weather is wonderful, and you still decided to spend this morning talking about books and talking about ideas. So thank you very much. I'm really very, very pleased to be here, and I will try to do my best in terms of today's presentation. I'm not sure how it will go, because one thing, they forbid me to move anywhere around, and normally when I teach I walk. And second thing is that for the last 5 years, all my lectures were commentary on the pictures that I am showing. So they call it PowerPoint, and again, they forbid me to use PowerPoint. So we'll see how it will go. The only thing that I can promise you that I'll try my best. Last week brought very interesting news, I'm sorry, from the region. And those news had a word that was not there in reporting maybe for the last 20 or 24 years. And that word was union. So in Astana, in Kazakhstan, leaders of 3 post-Soviet republics, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, signed agreement on the creation of economic union. So as far as I know, this is the first time since 1991 that the word union and not commonwealth, and something that is quite comprehensive, is used in media and re-entered political vocabulary. Well, in 1991, in December of 1991, it was from also Kazakhstan, not from Astana, but from Almaty, that the word came that another entity called Union, in particular the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, ceased to exist. At that time, leaders of 11 post-Soviet republics gathered together in Kazakhstan. Again, the same person, Nursultan Nazarbayev, hosted the event. And at that time, they decided that the union, not just old union, any kind of a union, is gone. It wasn't just the Slavic republics, there were also Central Asian republics, representatives of other countries, of other post-Soviet countries as well. So that turned out to be, in terms of the launch of my book, really, it's a disturbing news on one level. It is a welcoming news for me as the author. Because that reminded me about the situation 2 years ago when the manuscript was more or less ready, and I was looking for a publisher. And quite a few publishers were not interested at all. I'm really very fortunate with Basic Books and publisher Lara Heimert, who from the very beginning was interested in that, endorsed that, and yesterday I saw her at one of the events, and they said that no one could predict what would happen in the post-Soviet space except of Lara Heimert, who knew that and was interested in publishing this book. Why I wrote this book? There is a number of reasons. One of them is quite personal, and that was that I wasn't at that time in the country. I wasn't in the Soviet Union. I wasn't in Ukraine at the time when most of events in my book take place. And the chronological scope of the book is from July 1991. It starts with the last summit between President George H.W. Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, and then goes all the way till the end of December. So I left Moscow on the second day of the coup. So I witnessed the beginning of the coup, and then I came back on the 21st of December after teaching at the University of Alberta in Canada for one semester. On the 21st of December, the time when in Almaty they decided that there was no Soviet Union anymore. And when I came to the University of Alberta, they asked me to teach a course on the USSR in crisis. And at that time, I was working on the 17th century history. I said, come on, I can't do that. And the answer was, well, but the students want that. And coming from the Soviet Union, I thought that professors teach what they want, not what students want. And I certainly changed my view on that. So I decided, okay, I'll teach course on the USSR and crisis, but I knew nothing about economics. They wanted me, okay, let's teach about democracy and triumph of democracy in Moscow. I said, I'm coming from Ukraine. What I know and my perspective is very different. It's not about triumph of democracy. This is about mobilization of national identity. They said, no, who is interested in nations? Who is interested in the republics? This is not important. I said, well, that's the only course I can teach. So I prevailed. By the time the course was over, the Soviet Union disintegrated. Not exactly because of the triumph of democracy in Moscow, but because of national mobilization in the republics, including Russia. So when I revisited literature on the fall of the Soviet Union, it was 3 years ago. There was a 20 years anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union. I found out that actually what I saw and what I read, I still wasn't satisfied with that. There was little in terms of the perspective and the experience that I had that was reflected in those books. So the republics were not there. The history was focused on Moscow and partly on Washington as well. Very important parts of the story, which are also part of the story that I tell in my book, but the republics were not there. And that's why I thought that the only way to correct those misinterpretations or omissions would be to write a book. I had to act and formulate my argument against a number of existing already narratives of the fall of the Soviet Union. So the first of them, I'll start with Russia. And what is quite popular today in Russia in terms of interpretation of and understanding of the causes of the fall of the Soviet Union is this kind of a conspiracy theories, that it was a CIA or it was some kind of a mysterious Harvard project. that people ahead of time were planning the destruction of the Soviet Union, and actually that's what happened. I didn't like that. I couldn't find much of evidence